would you mind just everybody sitting in the middle section? What will happen, people will keep coming in and they'll end up sitting where you are, and then you're going to be mad. They took my seat and Pastor John made me sit in the middle. But if you could sit close to the middle and even fill in this front row too, that would be great. On the weekends, one of the things that bothers me is preaching to an empty front row. Sometimes I make people move. I don't like to do that, but thanks for getting as close to the middle as possible. There's still seats there. That'll make it a little bit easier. So, yeah, this is great. Awesome. Well, before we do anything else, look around to somebody you don't know and just say hi. Introduce yourself. You probably don't know everybody here, so meet somebody. Meet and greet somebody. Try to remember their name. Try to remember their name if you can. That's fantastic. Good to see you guys. Good. Keep coming in. I just asked everybody to sit in the middle, so if some of you guys can move in this middle, even towards the back, that would be really, really helpful. And if you just want to be rebellious and not listen to me, then I'm not going to force you. All right, well, God bless all of you guys. Let me just say something real quick, and nobody wants to hear me talk, so I'll get our guest up here. But this class is called Science and Creation, and we're in a series right now on the weekends. I look around, I recognize most of you. I don't think I recognize everybody, but if you come to the Cause Church, we're 2 weeks now into a series on the book of Genesis, the first book of the Bible, we're calling it Origins, Back to the Beginning. And so the first weekend, 2 weeks ago, I preached a message on creation. And as I was preparing, I thought, I need to bring one of my friends here who can speak literally much more intelligently on this subject and much more in depth than I can. And so the person that I thought of is the gentleman that you're going to hear in just a moment. His name is Stephan Ichiriu. He is one of the smartest guys I've ever met. He has an earned doctorate in physics from Caltech, and somehow he ended up in ministry, and he's a pastor, which is always just hilarious to me. He's the smartest pastor I think maybe I've ever met, other than maybe Pastor Jack Hayford, but very well educated, brilliant guy. I met Stephan. Stephan would probably remember this. I don't remember the details. Over about 20 years ago, I think, Stephan, when you started attending Faith, and so we've maintained our friendship. We've been out of Faith for a while, but Stephan is just he's a really smart, well-educated man, articulate, but he loves the Lord. You know, you'll hear that as he teaches. He loves the Lord, and he really loves people. He's a great pastor. I know that Stephan is a genuine pastor, and he's doing a great job at Faith Church with my family and my cousin Dan. I'm very proud of you, Stephan. I really am proud of your family, and it's an honor. It's a great honor for us to have you here tonight. So I'm going to hand it over to Stephan in just a minute. He's going to share, and I think at the end, by the way, towards the end, we'll do question and answer, because I promised that. So if you have a question, what I would encourage you to do is probably write it down. I don't think that we necessarily supplied any paper. If you need something, Pastor Judy or myself will help you. But write your question down, and that'll help you remember. And then we'll try to get to as many of those as we can tonight. Sound good? Lord, bless our time. Thanks for bringing everybody here. We have people watching online too. And thank you for Dr. Ichiriu, Lord, and speak through him tonight. We have ears to hear. We have hearts to receive. Teach us about who you are as the Almighty Creator. Help us to learn some things, Lord, that are going to be helpful to us and strengthen our faith and make us smarter too. In Jesus' name, amen. Would you welcome my friend, Dr. Pastor Stephan Ichiriu?
Thank you so much, Sean. God bless you, sir. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you so much for being here tonight. When Pastor John called me a little over a week ago and shared with me what he was going to be speaking on and asked me to come down here and share with all of y'all, I was so honored. As Pastor John mentioned, my background is in physics. That's how I came out here to California. Grew up in Hawaii, went to college in Indiana, and then came out here to California so I could go to graduate school at Caltech. And as I was in graduate school, the Lord just really started to do some things in my life and in my heart, and really developed a love for people and ministry in ways that I had never even anticipated or expected when I was growing up. Man, I did not grow up in a Christian household. My background was that my dad was an atheist. He was an anesthesiologist, and to him, If you believed in anything that was faith-related, believed in God at all, that meant that you were deluded, that religion was the source of all kinds of conflict through our world. And so that is the environment that I grew up in. And as I was getting to the end of my high school years, my life felt empty. I felt like there was something that was missing, even though I felt like there were things that I understood about the world, the natural world, from the things that my dad had taught me. I felt like there was something that was extremely missing from my life, deeply spiritually, there was just a void. And I went to an Episcopalian high school there in Hawaii, and one of the requirements that we had at that high school was that we had to take a semester of Bible. So I would tell my friends as I was going to Bible class that I'm going to go look for God. I'm going to find God here today. God was knocking at my heart, but I wasn't hearing him. And so he knew how to get through to me, though. And when I was a senior in high school, there was a girl. That's how it works, right? That's how it worked for me. Her dad was a pastor. He invited me out to church and be a part of their gatherings on Sunday mornings, and I was just blown away by the love, the sense of community, and just the grace that I found within their church. Absolutely changed my life, and I gave my life to the Lord at the age of 18. Went off to college, as I mentioned, in Indiana, and then came out here to California for graduate school, and as I was doing so, I found Faith Church up in West Covina, and just absolutely fell in love with the church, and as I mentioned, grew closer and closer to the Lord and grew a heart for ministry and entered into full-time ministry after getting my PH.D. So I don't know very many junior high youth ministers who came from a PH.D. physics background, but that was my deal. And so this whole topic that we're talking about here tonight, as far as science and creation, is something that's been near and dear to my heart for a long time because of that background that I have, with the family of origin, my dad being an atheist, teaching me about naturalism and believing that, the natural world is all that there is in this world. And so as I became a Christian, I wanted to understand, what does the Bible have to say about creation? How can I reconcile what I see in science with what I read in Scripture? And I was so torn about this because everything that I'd been taught up until that point in my life, that I had given my life to the Lord, was that, if you believe it all in the Bible, then you have to kind of check your mind at the door. You have to check your rational thought at the door. And that just is how it is. What I've come to find, though, is that there are many, many wonderful Bible-believing scientists who understand and know the scientific method. They understand and know how to approach things from that kind of rational mindset. And they also know how to reconcile what they see in science with what they see in Scripture. And so where I want to start here tonight is by taking a look at this picture right here. This is something that many of you have probably seen before. So let me ask you, what do you see? What do you see? Some of you, as you look at this, you see a young lady. You see a young lady who has her head turned away. She's looking kind of demure. Others of you, as you look at this picture, you see an older woman who looks kind of haggard, who's got a prominent nose. So, sounds like someone saw that for the first time just right now. So, here's a picture that when you look at it, you can interpret it a couple of different ways. And so what I want to do here for you tonight is not necessarily go into the deep ins and outs of all the different types of ways that people can understand the discrepancies the so-called discrepancies between Scripture and science. But I want to kind of present a survey of different ways that Christians are able to reconcile their faith in God. Whoa. And also the creation account as it's told in Genesis. So I am not an expert on all of this. So my background when it comes to... Oh, Pastor John. My background in physics is that I studied semiconductor device physics. And so that was the main point of my thesis. But I definitely have a love for all of these things as it pertains to apologetics and understanding science and Scripture. And so what I aim to do here tonight is to share the strongest possible case for each viewpoint that I'll present. And I also want to present to you some critiques of each one of those viewpoints as well. So some important questions as we're looking at the beginning of the universe is, number one, how did the universe begin? And number two, how did life begin? So these really pertain to the question of origin, right? Where did we come from? Not only where did we as human beings come from, but the universe itself, where did that come from? You know, if you take a look about 100 years ago, it was pretty much the accepted scientific fact that the universe was eternally existing. If you ask the majority of scientists, they would say that the universe has always been here and it always will be. And so there was really not a question of origin, it just was, and so there's no explanation for how it got here. But about 100 years ago, it became clear through different experiments that had taken place and the predictions that Einstein had come up with through his theory of special relativity and general relativity, that the universe actually did have a beginning. And so that sent shockwaves through the scientific world. Scientists did not want to accept that there was a beginning to the universe, because if there was a beginning to the universe, then you had to explain what was it that caused the beginning of the universe. So this opened up the question about the existence of God and the influence of God within our natural world. So not only do we want to take a look at that question as to how the universe began, but we also want to take a look at the question of how did life begin? Now, in prefacing this, I want to share something with you that you've probably heard before, but it's a quote by an archbishop of the church, and I believe this was back in the 1600s. He shared this, that in essentials, we'll have unity. So we're talking about things like Jesus as the Son of God. We're talking about things like his death and resurrection and the propitiation for our sin. Now, in non-essentials, we're going to have liberty. So there can be a variety of different viewpoints as to how this all came about. And when it comes to things like, the tribulation, are you pre-trib, post-trib, a-trib? Those are things that we can have a difference in viewpoints as Christians. But in all things, we want to have charity, which is that King James word for love. So even amongst this room, we're going to have a variety of different opinions and thoughts and viewpoints on what exactly happened and how it all came to be. But in all things, we want to have love for one another. And so I want to start tonight with one of the ways that people can understand the beginning of the universe, which is through intelligent design. Now, what are some of the things that people who hold to this viewpoint of intelligent design, what do they believe? So, for someone who believes in intelligent design, they would hold that the universe began with a Big Bang about 13.8 billion years ago, and that the Earth itself was formed about 4.6 billion years ago, and that God intervened at various times in history to direct the development of life as we know it. So, someone who holds to this viewpoint of intelligent design would see that God has been at work behind the scenes directing the processes by which we came into being. So God was the first one who spoke everything into existence. And 13.8 billion years ago, according to this viewpoint, the universe came to be. And as it started to form different, the planets formed and the stars formed and all the different galaxies and whatnot, that eventually the earth formed as well. And God, through special intervention on earth, started to develop life. Now, Paul Davies, who's a theoretical physicist, he says this, that there is, for me, powerful evidence that there is something going on behind it all. It seems as though somebody has fine-tuned nature's numbers to make the universe. The impression of design is overwhelming. You see, when you take a look at the universe, there are certain things that are basically kind of baked into the equations. They are these set of physical constants that have specific values that seem to be fine-tuned so that the universe can support life. Things like the mass of the electron, the charge of the electron, things like the strength of gravity, all of those different physical constants are fine-tuned so that it can support life here on this earth. And if any one of those were changed by even the smallest amount, what we would see is that life could not exist. So it looks awfully suspicious, like someone has been fiddling with the works. Now, for people who hold to this view of intelligent design, there are two main components to this view. There's this view of irreducible complexity, and there's also this idea of specified complexity. So let's talk a little bit about that. A system is irreducibly complex if it contains a number of different components that work together to accomplish a task. And if you remove one of the components, the system would no longer function. So to use an example from something that we all know, a mousetrap would be something that is irreducibly complex. It contains 5 or 6 different parts, and taking away any one of those parts would break it. It would no longer work the way that it's designed to work. All of the parts need to be matched together. And so the question is, can evolution produce a mousetrap? Evolution says that through a process of natural selection and small variations through genetic modification and mutations, that these different biological systems came to be. But if you just have the board for the mousetrap, or if you just have the spring for the mousetrap, it's not going to work. You need to have all of these systems together in order for it to function properly. So do we see systems like that within biology? Yes, we do, as a matter of fact. One of those systems would be something like cilia. So the cilia are those little hairs that you have in different body parts that help to move things along. So necessary parts, you have these microtubules that provides this whip-like structure. You have the nexin, which prevents microtubules from moving with respect to each other so they can move independently. And the dynin, which are the motor proteins that convert ATP to mechanical work. So all of those are necessary components in order for the cilia to function as it's supposed to. If you take away any one of those and it no longer is going to perform that function, it's going to be broken. So could evolution produce something like this? Another example is the bacterial flagellum. You look at this, that's a pretty complex set of machinery. Again, you've got a whip-like propeller that's attached to a drive shaft by a hook protein, which acts like a universal joint. You have energy that's provided by the flow of acid through the bacterial membrane. You have 30 to 35 proteins that are required to create a functional flagellum. And you also need other sensory inputs to direct bacterium toward food, light, so you need some type of light sensor, some way of directing this thing to where it needs to go. So you look at something like this, you take away any one of those parts, and it's not going to function. So could evolution, this process of blind mutation and natural selection, could it produce something as complex as this? So proponents of intelligent design would say that these things, they're irreducibly complex. It looks like this is something that has some kind of purpose or design to it. You look at it, and it's not something that's just going to appear out of thin air. There's intelligence, there's an engineering mind that created things like this. That is the idea of irreducible complexity. Now, another aspect to intelligent design is the idea of specified complexity. Specified complexity is present in a configuration when it can be described by a pattern that displays a large amount of independently specified information and is also complex, which has a low probability of occurrence. Okay, so it's a lot of complicated words, so let's kind of break that down a little bit. What's an example? Something that is specific would be like the letter A, right? That's a specific letter. Now, if you have a string of random letters, then that is complex, but it's not quite specific, right? Now, if you have something like a Shakespearean sonnet, that is both specific, it carries meaning, it carries information with it, and it's also very complex. So, what are some examples of specified complexity? Well, we talked a little bit about the fine-tuning of these physical constants. So at the beginning of the universe, these constants like the mass of the electron, the charge of the electron, the gravitational force, the Hubble constant, all these types of things, they needed to be specified to a high degree of specificity in order for us to experience life here in this universe the way that we see it. Another example is the information content within DNA. We all know that DNA contained within our cells, it describes our genetic makeup, right? So our eye color, our hair color, different aspects of who we are, our height, those kinds of things are determined in part by our DNA, and then which of those genes get expressed through epigenetics. So there's a ton of information that is contained within DNA. Information is the product of something like a mind, right? So we can come up with information, we can generate ideas and thoughts, and we can convey those things to other people. We can express ourselves in a way that we can be understood by others because we have minds that are able to express that and convey that kind of information. A blind process like evolution would not be able to generate this type of complexity. It would not be able to generate this type of information. You can have some kind of a small organization or like, for example, crystalline structures. They have a regularity to them, and those are naturally occurring within nature, but you don't have something that would be quite as complex as DNA, which can describe how it is that our eyes get formed, how our hair gets formed, all of those parts of our bodies. And Charles Darwin himself, he said this: if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. That's coming from the man himself. So, intelligent design holds that the universe, most intelligent design proponents would hold that the universe is about 13.8 billion years old, that the Earth itself is about 4.6 or so billion years old, and that God intervened throughout history by designing and creating these systems so that through these processes where he would intervene, we would have the development of higher and more complex life forms. There are some critiques, though, to this viewpoint. So one critique that would come from many within the scientific community is that it's not really a scientific theory. It provides no testable hypotheses that you could check out. So from these ideas of irreducible complexity and specified complexity, can you generate some type of hypothesis or a prediction that you could test against nature and see if that really holds? And opponents to intelligent design would say that you can't really do that. So it's not really a scientific claim that you're making. It's more pseudoscientific. It sounds great, but there's no predictive power within this model. It also, to some, would appear to be an argument from ignorance, this God of the gaps kind of idea. So what is, this idea of God of the gaps? Well, back years and years ago, right? Before we had modern understanding of electricity and those kinds of things, when there were storms and you would have lightning and thunder, people might assume, that's the work of God and, he's angry or something. And so that's what God is doing. It's a direct action of God. But as our understanding of nature has developed, we have come to know that what happens is that there's a buildup of static electricity inside of these clouds, and because of the charge differential between the clouds and the ground, that there's this electrical potential difference, and it grows to the point to which the electricity is able to flow from the cloud down to the ground or wherever it is. And so now we have greater understanding of what's actually happening physically within these systems. And so because of that, we don't any longer need to have this explanation of, it was God that did it. So opponents to the intelligent design idea would say that, it sounds an awful lot like that kind of God of the gaps kind of idea. There are some theological implications as well to this idea of intelligent design. It asserts that there are repeated miraculous interventions in addition to design laws. So, these interventions might imply to some people that the initial designs were imperfect and that God had to go back and kind of change things. So, some people would interpret it that way. Now, what is another way of understanding how God may have created the world? Another would be this idea of biologos, or some people would call it theistic evolution. So according to people who hold this viewpoint, biologos, again, this is the viewpoint that most closely ties together with the scientific account for how the world came to be. So the finely tuned universe began with a Big Bang about 13.8 billion years ago. Evolution occurred as biologists describe it, but under the direction of God, although there was no supernatural intervention. So in other words, what they believe is that God set up the systems and got it going, but then did not need to intervene in order for the outcome to come about where we as human beings evolved through the process of natural selection and genetic modification. So humans, according to this view, would be the process, or would be the result, of evolutionary processes. And despite this, humans are unique moral beings with a spiritual nature. We see that morality inside of us, and looking across all cultures, we see that there's an orientation towards the spiritual. So the way that biologos would describe this process is this way. God creates all living things through Christ, including humans in his image, making use of intentionally designed, actively sustained natural processes that scientists today study as evolution. So God used the process of evolution, including natural selection and genetic modification, to achieve the result of humans coming into being. Now, why is it that they might believe this? Well, a lot of that comes from taking a look at the human genome. When you take a look at the genome, there are different regions of human DNA that have highly significant matches with the genomes of other mammals. So there are different regions of the genome that look like they do certain things. They're active regions, they're coding regions, and then there are other regions of the genome that are non-coding regions. And many of those genes that are part of those coding regions, they show discernible matches to things like fish or mammals like mice. Some genes are even similar in yeast and bacteria, and sections between genes, those non-coding regions, they have fewer similarities. So when you take a look at those genetic similarities between different animals and humans, this is what we see. That between chimpanzees and humans, within those coding regions, the genes, there's a very close match, 100% match. Then in the random DNA segments, it's a 98% match. Dogs, 99% match. Non-coding regions, the 52% match. Mice, 99% match. This is the reason why scientists are able to do testing of different, drugs and things like that within mice, because their genes are very close and similar to ours, and so their biological systems will behave very similarly to ours. So they can do testing of these things within mice and then do human testing. Chickens, 75% match. Fruit flies, 60%. And a roundworm, 35%. And according to this view, this kind of shows that there's common ancestry. So that if we go back, there would be a common ancestor that was at the root of everything, all life that we see here on planet Earth. I've got a couple of videos here that I'd like to show you from Biologos. They have an organization that promotes these views. And so I want to give you an explanation according to their website, showing what evolution is all about and trying to understand that from a more Christian perspective. And so let's take a look at this video. You know, sorry, having some technical issues here. Sorry about that, folks. Let me see if I can change some settings here. There we go.
We often hear critics of evolution saying things like, a dog could never have evolved from a cat, or if humans evolved from monkeys, why are there still monkeys around? These kinds of statements reveal a misunderstanding of what scientists mean by evolution. Think of it like this. If you go to a family reunion, the people of the same generation are not descended from each other. They are related because if you go back far enough in the family tree, you'll find an ancestor they all descend from. Species we see today are like distant cousins on the family tree, but you have to go back many, many more generations to find their common ancestors. Even still, these cousins appear to be too diverse to share a family tree, but such change can happen because of variation and selection over lots of time. Since offspring differ slightly from their parents, some differences provide a reproductive advantage, and so these traits can work their way through successive generations, like some gazelles that are faster than their kin and can therefore more easily escape cheetahs and reproduce. This leads to more gazelles in subsequent generations that are faster. Some people call this microevolution. Positive variations are more often passed on and can cause the characteristics of populations to change over time, but this doesn't yet account for the different species we see today. Sometimes one part of a population becomes isolated. For example, through a rare event, a population of birds could colonize a remote island. New variations that occur in this island population will not be passed along to the group on the mainland. Over long stretches of time, variations in offspring and different ecological factors could even cause enough changes so that the island birds can no longer mate with the mainland birds. These kinds of changes take thousands of years. We see many of them in the Hawaiian Islands, the world's most isolated island chain. Not surprisingly, there are many exotic species of birds, insects, and plants that are not found anywhere else on Earth, but whose genetic heritage we can trace to continental species. This kind of evolution does result in distinct species, but these are still relatively close cousins on the family tree. To see the common ancestry of more distantly related species, we need to understand the ongoing variation over millions of years that can result in significant structural changes. Some people call this macroevolution. We'll look at this in our next video.
So when it comes to this idea of microevolution, these small changes that take place over time, these adaptations, we see that actually taking place within the world around us. You probably in school remember hearing about the peppered moths, right? Where during the Industrial Revolution, they started out as predominantly light-colored, and because of pollution, they predominantly became dark-colored and then back to light-colored after some of the pollution had been cleared. You also probably heard about that with Darwin and his finches, right? Going down to the Galapagos Islands, where there's a variation in beak length depending on the island that he was on, because of the types of food sources that were available on those islands. And so that is something that we actually observe here in our present day world, and we're able to see that even with things like E. coli cultures. There's an experiment that's been going on for over 30 years where there's a scientist who has been seeing these millions of generations of E. coli that have developed over the course of this long-term experiment. And what's happened with these E. coli bacteria is that they've flipped a switch within their genetic makeup where they're now able to digest citrate. So these are things that we've observed within the world around us. Now, want to take a look now at this next video, which talks about macroevolution.
In the previous video, we looked at microevolution, small changes in a population on relatively short timescales. Most critics of evolution accept this, but are skeptical of macroevolution, the claim that small changes can add up to big changes over long stretches of time. While the particulars of the mechanisms for such change are not all fully understood, there is very little disagreement among biologists that we now have powerful models of macroevolutionary transitions. These models make testable predictions and are continuously being refined by new evidence. Whales provide a clear example of macroevolution. Though superficially similar to fish, they are in fact mammals. Even Darwin wondered whether whales had evolved from mammals on land, but he had no real empirical evidence for such a claim. Now we have impressive evidence. In 1978, a 49-million-year-old skull was discovered that belonged to a land-dwelling wolf-like creature, whose inner ear structure was curiously similar to that of modern whales. This led to a search for transitional forms, and very quickly a series of fossils spanning about 10 million years was found that showed clear signs of increasing adaptation to life in water. The spine and legs were modified to allow for more efficient modes of swimming. Nostrils moved toward the top of the skull, later becoming a blowhole, and hind legs eventually shrank to where they could no longer support the animal on land. Many more fossils fit into this picture of whale evolution. More than 1,000 specimens have been discovered in the Valley of Whales in what is now Egyptian desert. Remember, these are not necessarily direct ancestors of whales today. That's not how evolution works. It's more likely that these fossils represent related species that were evolving over millions of years, and taken together, they form an impressive picture of significant change in this lineage of mammals. This picture is not the result of wishful thinking or driven by unwarranted assumptions. It has emerged as the result of careful observation of evidence, which leads to the formation of hypotheses. These make predictions of future finds and are tested by observable evidence, which is open to the scrutiny of others. At BioLogos, we see this interconnectedness of life as a testimony to God's creativity. He worked through natural processes to fashion dinosaurs and daisies, weevils and warthogs, and human beings in his own image. He could have snapped his fingers to do this instantaneously, but both Scripture and the natural world reveal that God delights in working through processes to accomplish his will. Evidence from the fossil record, and also in the distribution and comparison of species, supports the claim that he worked through evolution. And today we find even more persuasive evidence in genetics. We'll consider that in our next video.
So this idea of macroevolution now, according to what they show in that video, is supported by the fossil record. And they give that example of whales transitioning between fish and developing from a mammal into a swimming creature, actually. We're going to watch another video in just a little bit that will present a different side of that same kind of transitionary picture, and maybe poke some holes in that idea a little bit. When it comes to macroevolution, what has often been missing is that idea of those transitional forms. Being able to see one type of body plan transitioning into a different type of body plan. So there's yet one more video that I want to show you here from BioLogos that relates to more of their kind of theological position and the implications for theology based off of their ideas.
What happens to Christian theology if evolution is true? Perhaps the best way of exploring this question is keeping in mind that God is the author of both Scripture and the natural world, and so ultimately, these can't contradict each other. Of course, in our human attempts to do theology and to do science, sometimes we get things wrong. That's why we need a healthy conversation between the two, to help correct human error made along the way, and so understand both books better. God's book of nature contains substantial evidence that the universe is old, that life developed over billions of years, and that humans are related to other life on Earth through a common ancestor. These discoveries have caused Christians to rethink how they understand some theological doctrines. But it is important to remember that the core doctrines of our faith are not at stake here. But discoveries in genetics do show that today's human beings did not descend from a single original couple, but rather from a group of early humans. Adam and Eve could still be real historical people, perhaps a pair chosen by God who represented the whole group in a first act of disobedience, or perhaps the Adam and Eve account tells the story of all of us falling into sin. Either way, we know that every human has rebelled against God and is in need of reconciliation with God. Evolution raises other difficult questions like, why was there so much death and suffering in the world prior to human sin? Some people point to Romans 5 and claim that there could not have been any death before human sin, and therefore evolution is wrong. But that passage is clearly speaking of human death. The more difficult question is why God would choose to create through a lengthy process that involves so much animal death and suffering. At one level, we suspect that, like Job, we'll never fully understand the secret ways of God. But keep in mind that while evolution raises some theological questions, in other ways it fits well with what we know of God's character from the Bible. God rarely acts swiftly, but seems to savor the process of creating over long periods of time. God partners with creation in bringing about His goals rather than doing everything directly Himself. God designed a process that favors cooperation and fosters moral development, such as greater parental care and altruism. Of course, this doesn't clear up everything. There is a lot of hard work involved in theology's conversation with evolution. At BioLogos, we're committed to this work, sponsoring this important conversation. Why? What's the point? We'll address that in our final video in this series.
So, according to their view, they would hold this view of natural selection and genetic modification and God working through the process of evolution as being compatible with Scripture. Now, there are some compromises that they need to make in order for those views to be held as compatible. You can't then hold to the view of Adam and Eve as actual original two human beings who generated the rest of the human population. So, what are some critiques of this viewpoint that they have? Well, random chance and undirected evolution could have generated a very different outcome. So, because God set everything up according to their view and just set everything in motion, but then did not intervene afterwards, who knows what could have happened instead? What if there was no mass extinction event and what ended up happening was reptilian life and dinosaurs became the intelligent life that we have here on this planet? So that seems kind of odd. But their response is, well, God knows everything, and if He stands outside of space and time, He would know every detail of the future, and so He could set up all of the initial conditions such that it would result in us as human beings being created. So it might be random chance from our perspective, but it's entirely determined from God's perspective. I don't know. That might be a little too far. And then also, at best, this view contends that Adam and Eve were part of a larger population of humans, at least 10,000 or so, that may ultimately this view may ultimately reject the concept of a historical Adam. So you'd have to view the beginning of Genesis through a more kind of figurative, allegorical lens if you hold to this view. And the rejection of a historical Adam may require adapting one's Christology as well. So your view of Christ, because Christ talks about Adam as a real historical person, right? So there's some problems here that need to be resolved. One viewpoint that I don't have represented in any of my slides here, but I think it'd be worthwhile for you to look into a bit, is there is a Christian philosopher by the name of William Lane Craig, who just recently, within the past couple of months, came out with a new book called In Quest of the Historical Adam. And so he started with the premise of wanting to understand from a scriptural perspective, what is the context, what is the type of, what is the literary style of Genesis 1 through 11? And trying to understand, can that be reconciled with the scientific record and what he sees there. And so it would be an interesting book to take a look at, and he sees that it is completely possible for us to resolve that. And the way that he does that is by actually putting the historical Adam back many hundreds of thousands of years earlier than what might be needed from just the straight Genesis account and taking a look at the genealogies there. So I'd encourage you to take a look into those resources on that separate interpretation. Now, another way of looking at the beginning of the world is through a young earth perspective. So if we hold that Scripture is authoritative, and we believe that Scripture holds all truth, then if there's a way for us to literally interpret the beginning of Genesis there as in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth was formless and void, and the Spirit of the Lord was hovering above the waters, and all of this stuff, that if we were to take a literal 6-day interpretation of the beginning of Genesis, that's another way of taking a look at things. So according to this young earth creation or a biblical creation, those who hold this viewpoint might kind of push back on that viewpoint of, or that label of young earth creation, and see it more as a, hey, we're holding to what the Bible says about this. So the Bible and its creation account hold ultimate authority according to this view. And God created the world within 6 24-hour time periods, 6 24-hour days. And part of the reason for that is when you take a look back at the Hebrew, so there's that word day. In Hebrew, it's yom. And in order for us to reconcile that word yom with some other interpretations of it being an old earth, old universe kind of model, then you need to interpret that day, that word yom, as more of an epic or a time period or something that's an extended period of time. And that is one of the allowed interpretations. What proponents of a young earth creation or a biblical creation perspective, though, would say is that because in the beginning of Genesis, when yom is used, it's always used in connection with a number, like the first day, the second day, that whenever that is used, that it always, in order for us to have biblical consistency, that always refers to a literal 24-hour time period. Now, some people who hold this viewpoint would allow for a gap in time between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2, and then you can have that maybe an old universe kind of idea here, right? So the universe is 13.8 billion years old, and so that would be the gap theory. But all people who hold this viewpoint would see that all humans are descended from two individuals, Adam and Eve, and that there was a worldwide flood, a global flood at the time of Noah, which was about 4,000 years ago, that really explains a lot of the features that we see in the world around us that get interpreted by others as being due to an old age for the earth. So it's really the flood that then results in the features of the earth that we see that others interpret as indicating an old age for the earth. And also, according to this view, God made the sun, moon, and stars, pardon that typo there, on day 4 after there was already plants on the earth. So that would be a young earth creation viewpoint. Now, in order to hold to a viewpoint like this, you now have to reconcile what the Bible says against what science, mainstream science, says. So in order to do that, many who hold to this type of viewpoint would make a distinction between observational science and historical science. Now, observational science is the stuff that scientists do today to understand the world around us, right? So when I was in graduate school at Caltech and I was doing all the experiments that I was doing towards understanding semiconductors, and I was working on a project trying to inject spin polarized electrons into a semiconductor. So that's observational science, right? It's something that's repeatable. It's something that you can do today, and somebody else could repeat the same experience, same experiment, and hopefully get the same result that I did. You come up with your hypotheses, you have repeatable observations, and you analyze that data in a way that helps to develop your understanding of creation in the present. So we can understand the world around us by observing the world, right? But when we're taking a look at things that happened in the past, like when we're taking a look at cosmology or anthropology, those types of things, paleontology, we're looking at past events and we have no way of repeating those things. And so that's really a different way of approaching things. You have to start with your observational science, and you have to, understand how the world works, but then you try to apply those principles to things that happened in the past, and sometimes you have assumptions that you make that might not hold in the past. So, for example, one of those things is, when you ask people, how do you determine the age of something, right? A lot of people would say, oh, you use carbon-14 dating, right? So carbon-14 is one of the radioisotopes that you can use in order to help determine the date of something, the age of something. But it doesn't only have to be carbon-14. It could be other radioisotopes as well. So radiometric dating is one of the ways that you can, determine what the age of something is. But it does require that you make a couple of assumptions. It makes the assumptions that you know what the ratios were of the parent and the daughter nuclei at the time that thing was created. So if you know what that is, then you can measure those things today and you can have a good estimate of what the age is. But if you're off in those assumptions, then you could have you could be inaccurate in your measurement, if that makes sense. So for those who hold to a young Earth creation model, you have to look at all these different ways that scientists have, perhaps explained evolution, the fossil record, and things like ice cores, and taking a look at how old things are. And you have to have a way of explaining all of those in a different way. So, for example, there's a video here that I'd like to show you from an organization called the Institute for Creation Research that is based out of Texas, and they're closely tied with another organization called Answers in Genesis, which is based in, I believe, Kentucky, which talks about some of the issues and problems that come up when you're taking a look at what mainstream scientists would say about things like the fossil record and determining the age of things. So let's take a look at this.
Do fossils really show that creatures gradually evolved from simple to complex? The late fossil expert and evolution defender Stephen Gould recognized they didn't. He said the fossil record shows two clear features. One, sudden appearance, and two, stasis. When a new creature is discovered in the fossil record, it shows up suddenly and fully formed, with no gradual forms that led up to it. That's sudden appearance. Then its basic form stays the same. It doesn't evolve, and that's stasis. All kinds of fossilized creatures show sudden appearance and stasis, including creatures like crinoids, mosasaurs, beardworms, horseshoe crabs, lobsters, and trilobites. Rather than gradual evolution, the fossil record shows each animal form suddenly appears. Trilobites have perfectly formed body parts right from the start. They show up suddenly with no ancestors and have some of the most complex eyes that ever existed on Earth. Does that sound like slow, gradual evolution? They first occur in Cambrian rocks, which often represent the first deposits from Noah's flood. But even when found high above Cambrian rocks, trilobites still look like trilobites, as though they were created to reproduce more of their own kind. In The Origin of Species, Charles Darwin hoped future fossil finds would show examples of in-between creatures demonstrating evolution. So far, it's just more stasis. Creatures appear suddenly, fully formed, and they keep the same form. And that's what we'd expect to find. God's fully formed creation we read about in the book of Genesis.
So, it seems like a little bit of a problem for evolution, right? You see these fully formed creatures just appearing within the fossil record, and you don't really have those transitional forms. One of the big problems is with the Cambrian explosion, where you see within the fossil record different types of creatures that existed before then, but all of a sudden within the Cambrian period, all of these different unique, different body plans, different ways of organizing different creatures, they appear within the fossil record within a very short geological time period. So how do you explain that kind of just variation that appears within such a short time period if you're relying only on this kind of genetic modification and natural selection over long periods of time? That's a really difficult challenge for evolution to overcome. I want to show you now, a few minutes ago we took a look at one video from BioLogos that talked about the evolution of whales and the transitional forms. Here's a video from the Institute for Creation Research that talks about that same animal group.
In 1859, Darwin speculated that bears evolved into whales. But does this story hold water? Secular scientists support Darwin's hunch with two main arguments. One, fossils, and two, useless features, also known as vestigial features. They claim that fossils show a clear evolutionary progression from land mammals to whales. But many of these fossils are incomplete. Take the famous fossil Pachycetus. Scientists first found an incomplete skull, and it didn't even have a body. Later, a more complete Pachycetus discovery revealed perfectly normal legs. Pachycetus lived on land. Or Rhodocetus. At first, with only one head, spine, and a few other bones, secular scientists imagined it had front flippers and a whale tail. But just like Pachycetus, later discoveries revealed that it was just a land-dwelling mammal. Sadly, some museum illustrations still show whale tails on Rhodocetus. Without Pachycetus or Rhodocetus, the main missing links vanish from whale evolution. So, we have whale kinds or land mammals, but nothing in between. Secular scientists often point to vestigial features as evidence for evolution. They assumed that certain whale hip bones were useless legs left over from land mammals evolving into whales. Come to find out, those bones play a pivotal role in helping whales reproduce. They aren't useless at all. The most complete scientific evidence refutes Darwin's hunch. Instead of transitional fossils and useless features, we find fully formed creatures according to their created kinds.
So who do you believe, right? It's hard to know sometimes because you see one thing which sounds, oh, that sounds pretty convincing, and then you see another set of evidence that sounds pretty convincing now. It reminds me of there's a proverb that talks about how one person in a court case, that sounds right, until you hear the cross-examination and you're like, oh, okay, well, now that sounds right. So it can be difficult sometimes to know who to believe, what to trust, and what really to believe about these things. So one more video that I want to show you here is in relation to talking about ice cores. Now, we'll just play the clip.
Secular scientists often say that thick ice sheets like those in Greenland took hundreds of thousands of years to form. They say each layer represents 1 year, so all you do is count the layers to get the age, right? Wrong. It's not that simple. Scientists pull out long tubes called ice cores. At the top, the layers are easy to make out, but does each layer really represent 1 year? Crater Glacier on Mount St. Helens is only 30 years old, but it's already over 300 feet thick. This is because winter storms can deposit multiple layers at a time. So when counting ice cores, scientists have to guess at how many layers count as 1 year. Deeper down,
Sorry about that. Let me go
secular
ahead
science layers are easy to make out, but does each layer really represent 1 year? Crater Glacier on Mount St. Helens is only 30 years old, but it's already over 300 feet thick. This is because winter storms can deposit multiple layers at a time. So when counting ice cores, scientists have to guess at how many layers count as 1 year. Deeper down, the layers get squished together. It becomes impossible to see them. Scientists have to find a different way to count. One way is to measure the amount of dust in each section. They assume that a spike in dust content represents 1 year. But dust storms and snowstorms can cause multiple spikes in each section. Other times, scientists use mathematical models to estimate how many layers are in a section of ice. But these models assume hundreds of thousands of years to begin with. No wonder they think ice sheets are old. Creation scientists have a different answer. After the worldwide flood, the Earth entered a worldwide ice age for around 400 years. High snowfall rates could easily form the thick ice sheets we see today. Ice sheets don't need hundreds of thousands of years to form. They were part of the ice age that was caused by the flood in Genesis, the first book of the Bible.
So here again, you have assumptions that are made from scientists in order to determine the age of these ice cores and how many years had passed since certain layers were created. And because of the assumptions that you start with, and you're already assuming that these things have a certain age to them, your models have that information kind of baked into them. And so if you're starting with bad information, if you're starting with bad data, you're going to produce bad results, right? So it can be very concerning if this is what your starting assumptions are, you're going to generate bad conclusions. So there are many critiques, though, against young Earth creationism. So it rejects the mainstream view of the age of the Earth and the universe. So in order for someone to hold to a young Earth viewpoint, you'd have to overcome all of the scientific data that speaks to the age of the universe and to the age of the Earth. For example, one of the ways in which scientists have determined the age of the universe to be about 13.8 billion years old is through looking at the cosmic microwave background radiation. So what that is At the very beginning of the universe, everything was extremely hot. And if you've ever seen like a hot piece of metal or a hot iron or something like that, that glows, right? It creates something called black body radiation. And so with the temperature of the early universe, as it started to expand and cool, what you would expect is that the light from that early universe would start to cool as well. And if you look at the background around us, you would see kind of the echo of the Big Bang in this microwave radiation. So scientists made predictions as to what the temperature should be, and sure enough, when you take a look at the microwave radiation in the background around us, not looking at specific stars, but just looking at those, all around us, what you see is that the temperature of the universe is just around like 3 Kelvin, which is about 3 degrees above absolute zero, which, according to the models and kind of fitting things to what scientists would assume, gives us an age of about 13.8 billion years. So when you have things like that, and then also radiometric dating, you have other ways of dating different samples that all indicate older ages to things, there's just a lot of evidence, or a lot of evidence for young Earth creationists to overcome in order to espouse a young Earth viewpoint. Young Earth creationism is also viewed by the scientific community as unscientific and untestable. Because if things were done through a miraculous act of God, then that's not something that can be tested. You can't say, "Hey, God, do it again." So it's not something that can be observed and tested once again. And also, young Earth creationists would be criticized for often explaining away things by questioning those underlying assumptions. Some of that comes with good reason, just as you saw in that video about the ice cores. But if you're always making arguments that, oh, you can't believe that because of X, Y, and Z, then that just puts you in a tough position. So let's take a moment now and let's compare some of these creation accounts. So, models for creation, we have young Earth creationism, including this Omphalos hypothesis, or the apparent age hypothesis. Maybe God created things looking old. That's a possibility. Although that's a hard one to swallow, because it would seem to indicate that God was maybe a little deceptive in creating the world to be looking as old as it does. There's this idea of gap creationism, where between Genesis 1 and Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2, that there's a gap of time between those two verses. So that's one way of seeing that there's what the age of the universe is, as being 13.8 billion years old. There's this idea of progressive creationism, intelligent design, and theistic evolution, or biologos. So what does that look like as far as acceptance within the U.S. and what the views are as far as the age of the universe and the age of the Earth? Again, young Earth creationists would hold that the Earth is less than 10,000 years old. Most would say that it's maybe around 6,000 years old. Some would only hold that this is true for the solar system. And as far as the Earth would be less than 10,000 years old. Again, probably closer to 6,000 years old if you're looking at that literal 6-day interpretation of the beginning of Genesis, as well as the genealogy that we see in the beginning of Genesis. Those who hold to an intelligent design or theistic evolution or biologos viewpoint would view the world as having its scientifically accepted age, or the universe as having its scientifically accepted age, and the Earth also as having its scientifically accepted age. Although some who hold to an intelligent design viewpoint would claim that the existence of the Earth is a result of divine intervention. when you take a look at, how popular are these viewpoints in the United States, these figures are from a few years ago, but acceptance in the United States as far as young earth creationism or gap creationism was around 40%. This is maybe about 4 years ago. And intelligent design around 38%, theistic evolution, intelligent design around 38%. And then as far as the biological species and the origin of man, young earth creationists and gap creationists would see that biological species and humans were directly created by God, and that macroevolution does not occur. Again, macroevolution is the large-scale changes that would take place, not just those small changes like beak length or moth color, that type of thing, which we do observe in the world around us. And those who are proponents of intelligent design or biologos would view that, intelligent design would view that there was divine intervention at some points in the past, as evidenced by irreducible complexity. And as far as humanity is concerned, those proponents of intelligent design would hold various beliefs. For example, Michael Behe accepts evolution from primates. Biologos, on the other hand, would view the origin of biological species and humanity as purely being from evolution, natural selection. Although those are systems, those are processes that were set up initially by God in their viewpoint. And again, acceptance in the US, around 40% for young earth creationism, and 38% for intelligent design and biologos. So where do we go from here? Well, let's end where we began, and taking a look at this picture once again. You can see in this picture a young woman or an older woman. You take a look at the evidence, and it's not quite clear how God may have actually done all of this. There are many questions that are still outstanding. And for some people, you might put different weight on different pieces of evidence. For example, one might think that the evidence of the cosmic microwave background radiation strongly points towards an old universe. Others might take a look at other evidence as it pertains to things like what were shown in the more recent videos regarding creationism and young earth creationism, and say that, hey, it's not clear that when you take a look at those ice columns that what scientists say is actually what is. And so there are going to be a variety of different viewpoints that we have about how this all came to be. But hopefully, in our time together here tonight, what you've seen are some plausible ways that you can make sense of science and Scripture, and that you can bring them together, and that they don't have to be in conflict with each other. I've heard it said that, bad science will conflict with bad theology. That bad science will conflict with good theology. Good science will conflict with bad theology, but good science and good theology, they're going to be in agreement. So thank you so much for your time here this evening. And I want to take a few moments here now to open things up if anyone has any questions. Yes. Oh, so yeah. Yeah, if you do have a question, as Pastor John was just mentioning, if you wouldn't mind using the mic right over there, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
Hello. Okay. Maybe some comments too. You talked about the background radiation, and the thing that I've always thought of is light traveling. Light takes time to travel, as we understand. So for a young Earth, God would have just put the light there, should have taken whatever 8 billion years to reach us, but after so many thousands of years, it reached us. That's the kind of thing for me in young Earth that's hard to swallow, because it's like, why would he do that? As you mentioned, he seems, or I think in the videos, seems to work through processes, right?
Right.
Over time. Jesus was born as a baby. He didn't just all of a sudden appear
Arrive
on the
as a
scene.
man, right?
Yeah. Okay, I guess that makes sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
What else was I going to say? I left my phone over there. Oh boy, I might have to come back. Shoot, I don't remember. Well, I don't remember, so I'll let the mic go.
Well, thank you. And I would agree that when you take a look at how God often works, and even that process of transformation in our own personal lives, oftentimes it is a process, right? There are moments where or people who you see that there's a miraculous transformation that takes place in their lives, and they're miraculously delivered from drug addiction, something like that. But for many people, and I would say the majority of people, what we see is that God works in their lives through some kind of process of redemption, and them going through a way of connecting with the community that will support them, and receiving His grace and redemption, and working through a process of getting to health. So.
Yeah, in response to that, though, there's tremendous countervailing arguments and examples. Jesus' recreation of the eye of a man who was born blind, and the taking of the dust and putting it in his eye, spitting on it is an act of creation that echoes Genesis, for example. Miracle, by definition, as one of the Christian philosophers, a great note has said, that the miracle is the notion that gravity is in work, that the hand of God grabs and stops the apple before it hits the floor. These examples indicate that this business of things just being ictic is not a valid objection necessarily. But that's not the main reason up here. De Mendel's opinions with regard to mutations still hold. For example, in all those millions of generations of flies in his genetic, I'm shot. For example, he concluded. Did somebody cut my mic off?
No, okay. I think we just adjusted it.
Yeah. I've got a big voice. Mendel concluded that all those millions of generations of flies, that mutation tended to be degrading and not augmenting. Do those findings within the world of genetics still hold?
Well, so I'm not a geneticist, and so I'll share with you from some of the things that I've read and seen. So there's that experiment that I shared about regarding E. coli, and it's been going on for decades now, and the development of the E. coli to be able to consume citrate. So it seems like there are examples of beneficial changes that might take place within a population, including, like, for example, the pepper moths changing in colors in order to help their survival of the moths. So I would say that as it pertains to like microevolution, where you see these small changes, these small modifications that are taking place, that you do see some beneficial adaptations that take place. I would agree, though, that the majority of genetic modifications or mutations that occur would be harmful.
Degrading.
Right,
okay.
Degrading.
Okay, another question with regard to the age of the Earth. Isn't another method for measuring time and the age of the universe in general, the redshift, again, is a still valid method? Is it not, of calculating
so
the
the
age of
redshift
things?
would actually give you the velocity of objects that are distant from you. So it can tell you how fast something is moving away from you. If you take then what you know about the velocity of different stars, and then kind of do the calculation backwards to see what at what age everything would coalesce back down to a single point. You can do that calculation, yes, and that would give you an indication of the age of the universe.
Okay. I mean, very simply put, if you've got a common point of origin, as in the Big Bang, and you've got things way out here, and you can measure the velocity of those things, then you can calculate.
Right.
You know, you can do an age versus speed calculation in the process, right? That still works.
Right, it does. It does. It gets a little more complicated because of the general relativity and all of that. Okay. And so, but yes, essentially that's what you're doing is you're calculating back how long ago everything was there at that single point.
Yeah. And then lastly, would you not agree that there is a huge atheistic prejudice in the scientific community that mitigates against the acceptance of divine action in creation? For example, Hugh Ross notes, with regard to the creation of the moon event, which took literally hundreds of converging things to happen the way they did, to yield the life-sustaining result of the existence of the moon, he quotes this. He says, these converging events in their numerous nature have created a profound philosophic disturbance in the scientific community.
Definitely.
Fujikawa tried to do genetic experiments and notes that, for example, there's not enough energy, resident energy in organic life to generate massive evolution. It takes a massive amount of energy to have generated and produced this reality. That great Japanese biogenesis published this and wound up having his results suppressed.
Yep.
Right?
Most definitely, yes. There is a strong bias against any type of religious viewpoint within the scientific community. And anything that does not have a naturalistic explanation or origin would be suppressed, for sure.
Yeah. And lastly, the biggest atheistic scientist is Dawkins. And when confronted by Ben Stein with how do you account for life in the terms that we know it came to exist, its complexity, do you know what the man's answer was? Aliens.
So here's the thing, though. If you believe that aliens were the ones to start life here on Earth, then you have to have an explanation for the aliens.
Yeah. I didn't understand anything that's been said in the last 5 minutes, so I'm just kidding. So I think I may have missed this, or maybe my terminology in my mind was a little bit different, Stephen, but could you just articulate, you talk very clearly about young earth creationism. Can you talk about old earth creationism? Is that the same thing as did you call it gap creationism? Anyways, does that question make sense? Could you speak to that for a minute?
Yeah, definitely. So thank you for asking the question, Pastor John. So old earth creationism can take several different forms. So for example, that gap theory that you mentioned, where there's there's a gap in time between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2. So that's one way of explaining an old earth. Another way would be using the viewpoint of like intelligent design or biologos, where the world was created through the scientifically accepted processes, and so through the Big Bang and through just the natural physical laws, generating the stars, galaxies, and all of that, and eventually then creating the Earth. So old Earth creationists would view, ultimately, God is the one who set everything into motion, right? So there's the Kalam cosmological argument that if anything begins to exist, that it has to have a creator. The Earth began, or the universe began to exist, and so therefore, the universe must have a creator. It must have a cause. Any of those viewpoints that would see that the Earth is, or the universe is old, 13.8 billion years old, would be considered old Earth creationist ideas.
Hi, thanks. I had a question. So I used to think that there are parts of Darwin's theory were plausible. So based on what we heard tonight, did we just like blow away the theory of natural selection? Can that exist within intelligent design, or do they conflict with each other?
Right. So, according to Darwin, the idea of natural selection is something that is completely unguided. There's no outside force. God is not acting within this process. So, if you're purely looking at a Darwinistic process, then it's genetic modification, so the variation that happens through mutations, and then it's survival of the fittest. And those are the only two things that are needed in order to generate the evolution that Darwin would propose. Biologos, those who hold to that type of viewpoint would say that God set everything into motion with the ultimate knowledge of where things would end up. And so God used that process of natural selection, genetic modification, survival of the fittest in order to get to where we are here today. That God knew that was going to happen. Again, there are some problems with that because that does have some theological implications that we talked about as far as kind of rejecting the idea of Adam and Eve as being the original first two human beings. The other way of approaching this could be, okay, maybe there's this idea of natural selection, but rather than it just being a completely blind process that's unguided, that God is working through the midst of all of this. And so that might be the viewpoint of some people who hold to intelligent design. So God is tweaking the genetic code, improving things, and going through a process of iteration to get different creatures to form into the beings that they are. So there are different viewpoints that you might have on that. And I think which one you would hold to would depend on what evidence you see as most compelling, if that makes sense. And I don't know that, so I'm not here to espouse a particular viewpoint. I would say that it's good to look into these things more deeply, just like Paul in I think it was Acts 17 said that the Bereans were more noble because they diligently searched the scriptures to see if the things that Paul said were true. And so just as we have the God's revealed word in the Bible, we also have God's revealed nature in the book of nature. We can see the world around us and hopefully learn new things and develop new understandings of who God is by looking at the created world. So hopefully that helps.
When people refer to the Big Bang, are they referring, or are they suggesting that all the mass in the universe was in one single point? Because if that's the case, wouldn't that make calculating the density of the universe impossible because it would be mass divided by zero volume?
Right.
Or is that do secular scientists even still hold the belief of the Big Bang? Because I believe I've heard some secular scientists saying that they've had to kind of reject that theory for various reasons.
Right. So there are different interpretations of all of that. So yes, if you take those equations, Einstein's field equations, and or the general relativity equations, and you dial them back, then yes, you would get to a singularity, which is what you're talking about. But there are ways that scientists like Stephen Hawking have gotten around some of those issues by, rather than coming back down to a single point, you kind of curve off things there at the very beginning. And that type of cosmology is something that I don't quite know the details of myself, but some ways to kind of work around some of those issues. That does not get around, though, the need for a beginning. So even if you round off the beginning and it's curved as opposed to coming down to a single point, then you still have the issue of the universe coming into existence, the universe beginning, and needing to have a creator for that. I would say also that there are different ideas that have been proposed. You've probably heard about things like multiverse theories and things that are popular in culture today because of Marvel movies and things like that, right? And those might be nice ideas, but it sounds pretty fantastical, doesn't it? To think that there would be this infinite multitude of universes. And it's kind of convenient that, okay, well, the way that you explain this away is that, well, we just happen to be in the one universe that supports life, and so you don't have to have all the universal constants, those physical constants, fine-tuned in all those other universes. It just happens to be fine-tuned in ours. So it's just, it seems to be a little contrived to me.
Okay, let me try again. So the biologos, the people that hold to that, or atheists that hold to evolution purely, at some point there must have been some kind of spark of life, right? Now, do they believe that this spark of life continues to happen? And if so, are generations of life forms, is that why we see bacterium and very simple, single cell organisms, or even less complex than that? Is that why we still see them? Because this spark is continuously happening and starting the chain. And if it's not happening anymore, should there not be a base level of complexity and nothing less complex than that?
Sure. Let me see if I understand the question. So if there's, so atheists or those who hold to that biologos viewpoint of natural selection and it being a completely unguided, unmiraculous sort of, spontaneous generation of life. So should we see that kind of thing happening today, right? Is that?
Well, we should be witnessing the intermediaries.
Right, we should be witnessing the intermediaries, yes.
Yeah.
And I would say too that it's a little odd that when you take a look at all of biological life, that you come back to a single common ancestor, and that if it's something that can happen, then why haven't we seen it happen more than once here on this planet? And you would expect then maybe that there might be other forms of life that could be generated as well. So that's a question that I don't really have an answer to, and so that kind of pushes me away from this idea of biologos and just atheistic natural evolution.
Yeah. I don't know if you brought it up or if it was the biologos video. They talked about maybe young Earth people or creationists saying, well, why are there still monkeys? Right. And them balking at that idea because hand wavy stuff. So I figure that that if we have the monkey, that there must, according to them, there must be this spark happening still. Why haven't they identified it? Why haven't they found it? If the Earth is too old now, we're not covered in lava anymore, or primordial soup, or however they would say it. And then there was that one spark that, there's the movie Children of Men where births ceased, and then they would report on the news, the youngest person, 35 years old, died, and so there's no one younger than that anymore. But we still have these very basic life forms that still exist. So it's either continuing to happen, we're not recognizing it, but also there's no intermediary species.
Or they would say that those life forms have some type of biological fit for their environment. And so the ecosystem can support all these different life forms, and we're not always going to, see things developing into more and more complex forms. If there's a fit for this type of organism, then it's going to continue to propagate, and we'll see more of them. So I don't know that it would require an additional, ongoing spark, if you will.
Okay. So now that we notice it, it stopped.
So that's the huge question that I have, is if this is something that could happen here, and it did happen apparently at one point in time, then why haven't we seen that happen again? Why haven't we seen several beginnings to life here on Earth, or potentially other places within the universe?
Thank you.
Hi there.
Two things. One, I have heard the definition of the day in the Bible, Hebrew yom, as also translated to epoch, which means like a period of time. So that's one way I kind of reconcile that it's not necessarily 24 hours, it's an epoch, and our English language is just so finite in our definition. So I just wanted to share that. And then I was wondering if you could clarify a little more about omphalos. You kind of skimmed over that really quick. And that,
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Omphalos, that theory that, because God didn't create Adam the baby. He created Adam the man. He didn't create an egg and just lay it on the ground. He created a chicken.
Right.
So I'd just like to hear your thoughts more on talking about how
that apparent
how that
age
theory
kind of idea.
could
Right. So this is the idea. Thank you. To respond to your first comment about Yom being an epoch, yes, that is another definition that you can use for that particular word. So young Earth creationists specifically would kind of balk at that idea because in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, that word is connected to a number, and whenever that word yom is connected to a number at other parts in Scripture, it always refers to a 24-hour time period. So that's where young Earth creationists would have some problems with that interpretation. But there are very many Christians who would also hold to that same interpretation, that yom means an epoch or a longer period of time. Now, in regards to your second question about wanting to unpack that omphalos idea a little bit more, so that's the idea that the Earth was created and the universe was created with an apparent age. And so with all the fossils, built into the geological record and all of those kinds of things, so the Earth would really be only about, however many years, 6,000 years old, according to the genealogies that we have in Genesis. But one of the challenges, I think, with that idea is it might, to some, make God out to be a little deceptive. So why would you create something to look a certain age if it's not really that age? I understand, the point that you made about, creating Adam as a fully grown man as opposed to a baby. But when you're taking a look at the fossil record and other things that would then seem to point other people towards, well, maybe the Earth is really older than it says in Genesis, then I think it's Romans that also talks about how, it's creation that reveals God to people. And by taking a look at the created world, we can know things about who God is. So it would seem to be a little bit at odds with that, to me.
My turn.
Hey.
So I've known Stephen for a long time before he became a doctor, and I just wanted to say hi to you.
What's up? How's it going, Jerry Clyde? It's good to see you, sir.
I do have a question, though.
Go for it.
You sure?
Yeah, please.
So life forms on other planets. So is there people on Uranus? That's it.
Oh, Jerry.
Hello, everybody. It's going to become very apparent to you that I'm not a public speaker, and I have no business being up here. Anyhow, if we look around our world and our connections with other people and how we relate to things, we see that we win a lot in the area of our being, and our will has explanatory power with those around us. And if we really did, we could win any type of argument simply by being smart. And I don't mean this as a put down, but for anyone that I disagree with, but the business of our speech having explanatory power, and with God behind us, we could win against any of these.
Yeah,
Any of these, and that's how I feel about it. I'm not there to put them down or but just to say, no, I don't agree with you, and what you got to say really doesn't amount to much, because it doesn't make sense. It doesn't have any power in what you're throwing down. So
definitely. I would say also that if we were completely rational beings, then yes. But we are not. We have emotions, we have our own will, we have our own prejudices, and so we can provide sometimes the most beautiful and clearly stated arguments for a well-held position, and you can still have someone who rejects that because of the sin that exists within all of us. So, I think our job is to be as prepared as we can to speak with people with grace and kindness, but to be prepared to give an answer for the reason why we have hope in Jesus.
So I just have a quick question. I don't understand how scientists explain the sheer variety of animals. I mean, let's just not even talk about plants, but the sheer variety of animals on the planet, from, insects, mammals to fish.
Right.
Do you have any idea how they reconcile that?
With enough time and through genetic modification and natural selection, what those who hold that Darwinian sort of idea is that you could develop different biological creatures that are well adapted to those environments, and so over time you can have bears and monkeys and whales and fish. So it requires a lot of time in order for evolution to produce the variety that we see in the natural world.
Right, but wouldn't that limit, based on natural selection and environment, for their arguments, you wouldn't have all of those things in the same place, you would...
Well, that's assuming that there's one way to skin a cat, if you will, right? If you have several different solutions, several different, genetic modifications or mutations that could be beneficial to the organism, then you could have one that splits off with this genetic modification and another that splits off with this other one, which also is beneficial, and then they kind of develop into separate species and evolve from there. So that's how scientists would approach that.
But none of that can be proven, correct?
So taking a look at the fossil record is, that's the best that scientists would be able to do, is taking a look at the fossil record and trying to understand how that works. And as far as, to use the young Earth creationist terms of observational science versus historical science, you can't go back and you can't evolve new species. Well, let me take that back. We have seen new species evolving when, like, for example, I've heard of around a volcano. If you have spiders that start on one side and they start to spread around the base of the volcano, that when they get to the other side, you might have two different species of spiders that are unable to mate with each other because they've just gone in different directions. So we do see things like that are taking place. We do see the evolution of different species in that way. But when you're talking about things at the higher level order of, kingdom, order, phylum, all of that stuff, that's not something that we can observe. According to evolution, it takes much larger timescales than we have to be able to observe those things.
All right, Judy told me to keep it clean, so I'm going to keep it clean here. So we know that God told Adam to name every animal, right? But yet we're continuously discovering new species and giving them new names. So were all those already predestined, right? Like he had all these names and we were just sort of discovering them as they came about? Or how does that sort of correlate with that record that we find in Genesis that he named all the animals?
It's a good question. So let me say this. When it comes to like a young earth creationist viewpoint, the way, because you have all these different species on planet Earth. And another problem that might be related to the question that you asked is, okay, how do you get two of every one of those onto a boat, right? So practically speaking, how do you have space for all those different animals on a boat? That's the size that Noah's Ark was. So the way that young earth creationists would resolve that conflict is they would say that, well, you don't actually need one of every different type of species. If you go to the level, the biological level of the family, so kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Thank you. I had to go through that like mnemonic in my head, but you guys remember that, I'm sure, from school. So if you go through that, then if you, rather than taking one of each species, you take one of each family, or two from each family onto the ark, then you only need to have maybe as few as 1,000 different animal pairs on the ark, and that's much more doable. So in that viewpoint, so you've got 1,000 different animal pairs on the ark, and then as they evolve into different species from there, then I suppose the people who exist at that point could name them. Sure.
What I'd like to do is I'd like to officially dismiss, but allow those of you that would like to stick around and still ask questions, as long as Stephen's willing to be here, to do so. But first of all, can we just take a moment? Can we thank Pastor Dr. Stephen Ichiriu for taking time out to be with us? And how many of you learned something tonight, or more than just one thing? I learned a whole lot. That was so good, Stephen. Thank you so much. So let me mention one thing real quick before I forget. I'm going to put this out there and see if there's interest in this. If you would be interested in attending a class that we would offer that kind of expands on this topic of science and creation, I have one other friend, Stephen, and another guy. I only have two friends. No, but one of my other friends, he's a retired science teacher, brilliant guy. I've actually sat down with him before and heard about a 2-hour presentation that he did that was specific on what he called old earth creationism and his perspective on that. But anyways, I talked to him today. He would be willing, if there's an interest, to come and to do probably a couple of classes where he would address different topics, go probably a little bit more in depth on young earth creationism, old earth creationism. He also could talk about dinosaurs. He could talk about aliens. He could talk about Big Bang, Neanderthals. So if you're interested in that, if that sounds interesting to you, on your way out, I think Pastor Judy's back there with a sign-up sheet. Just give us your name and your contact information, and then we'll let you know within a few days if we are going to offer that. If there's enough interest, we will. If it's just me and Bob, then forget it. We probably won't. I'll go have coffee with them. So I wanted to mention that. But yeah, so you guys are officially dismissed right now. If you need to head out, sneak out, go ahead. if you'd like to stick around and answer questions, we can do that. I just want to continue to use the microphone because we are recording this. Our stream didn't work, so I want to be able to pick up for people that might come back and watch later. But thank you guys so much for being here. I'll leave it here for another few minutes. If there's more questions, we'll go. If not, then we'll be totally done.
Why does God know everything?
Can you repeat that?
Why does God know everything?
How does God know everything? Well, I think Pastor John can address that question right there from a theological perspective.
Hello, I don't know if you answered this question already, but I was confused with the, sorry, if you were talking about that there's no transitional fossils found, so why do we still consider Darwin's theory of evolution? And also another question was, I know that they found, physical, evolution in species, but have they found any evolution in the brain of different species? Because I feel we're the only species that can actually, create.
Sure. So you're talking about, the first question is regarding the transitional forms, and so why do we still, believe in evolution?
Yeah, if there's no transitional fossils found.
Right. So what I would say is, I'm not sure that there are no transitional fossils that have been found, but more that we would expect to see a lot more than we actually see within the fossil record. And especially when it comes to something like the Cambrian explosion, where you see all these different body plans that develop in a very short geological time frame. So it's hard for biologists to explain, from my perspective, how that came to be with the short time frame and the just variety of different life forms that we see within that short time frame. So one of the reasons why I think scientists would hold to that is because it's the best explanation that they have. So without having to appeal to some type of creator, some type of outside force, if you're looking for a completely naturalistic explanation for how life began or how life evolved, then you kind of have to hold to that. And you might have other kind of ideas of, okay, well, there's this idea of punctuated evolution. So punctuated evolution is the idea that, okay, the genetic modifications build up over the course of time, and then all of a sudden, there's one switch that gets flipped, and those genes get expressed, and now we have like the development of a new limb or something like that. But we just don't see that within the fossil record. So that's to kind of address the first question there. I think it really has to do with, you got to be committed if you're completely naturalistic in your explanation of things. Now, to address the second question as about intelligence of other life forms and all of that, there are many, animals and creatures that seem to have emotion and lots of, human-like characteristics. But when it comes to things like our ability to plan for the future, the other, cognitive abilities that humans have, the ability for us to empathize, these are things that you don't really see within other animals. And so I'm not aware. Again, I'm not an expert in biology, and so I would be hard-pressed to, speak to this authoritatively, but I'm not aware of any other animals that have that type of cognitive ability.
There's this Christian speaker that I've watched and I read some of his work named Stephen Meyer. I don't know if he's talked about something, and I was hoping that maybe you might be able to expand more on this. An idea that there's 20 or so amino acids that form all of our proteins, and these proteins can be chains of hundreds of amino acids long. So if you have 20, and then they can be hundreds of longs, that means that there can be, millions and billions of different combinations of them.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that if if the DNA is what's codes for that, and you can only have that DNA mutation once per reproduction, and throughout, even if you look at the 4.6 billion year old Earth, there hasn't been enough time to have all of those reproduction events to try every possible mutation to test for all the different possible amino acid change that forms these different proteins to find useful ones. Can you be able to expand on that idea?
Yeah, well, I think that you did. You did a great job right there, and definitely Stephen Meyer is one of the strong proponents for intelligent design, and he is highly, I don't know exactly what his role is, but he's involved with the Discovery Institute there in Seattle, and they are strong proponents of that idea of intelligent design. So I would agree that there's a problem there because you have all these different combinations that, and there might be some combinations that are not allowed physically because of just the way the proteins fit together or the amino acids fit together. But still, you should, you're right, you know, there are many combinations that should be seen, and there's not been enough time for us to get to the kinds of proteins that are needed for life. So that's a great point.
Hi there.
Hi there.
Based on the video for the creationists, they talked about after the flood, there was a 400-year ice age. And they said it just so matter-of-factly, like everybody knows that. And I'm wondering, what are they basing that on?
You know, I'm not sure. So that is a great question. And I would say that if you want to look into that more specifically, that there would likely be resources available on the Answers in Genesis website or at the Institute for Creation Research. One of their websites would be able to expound on that idea a little bit more. That's not something that I'm familiar with myself either. So.
Okay, all right. Yeah. Answers in Genesis? Answers in Genesis,
and the Institute for Creation Research. So those are the two organizations. They're closely tied with each other, but those are the ones that promote a young Earth creationist viewpoint.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. Sure, yep.
So some years ago, it was noted that there have been repeated attempts to try to spontaneously generate life by running electrical charges through the primitive Earth's atmosphere or replications thereof. Never successful. And are there any attempts like that that are still continuing, or have those sort of been abandoned as fruitless at this point?
Yeah, you know, that's a great question, and I'm not aware of the current state of research on that side of things, but I recall hearing some questions about the veracity of those experiments that were done and how clean those environments were and how closely they replicated the original, you know, kind of conditions here on Earth as well. So I'm not aware of anything that would be able to speak to that like initial origin of, you know, life and like where do we go from organic molecules and all of that to, okay, now we have a living kind of creature. So
the irony of the failure, of course, is that those were intelligently guided experiments, and they still
exactly.
fail. You know, and what's the chance?
Exactly.
Now, again, in Grudem's great systematic theology, he notes, I'm wondering what you think of this, he notes that the calculus for the spontaneous creation of life is 10 to the 300th power. Have you read that? And do you know that upon that?
I haven't read that specifically myself, but you know, I'm not surprised that there would be figures like that, whether it's that exactly or something close to it. To calculate a number like that, you're going to have so many factors in there that may have different uncertainties that, you know, we just don't have a tight knowledge of, or a very precise knowledge of. So regardless of whether it's 10 to the 300 or whether it's 10 to whatever, these are astronomical odds for life to begin. And I think that for me, to believe that it was all just spontaneous and that there was no supernatural input into the systems here, it's a little hard to stomach.
So, can you speak to the anthropic principle for us? Because I think
Sure.
that is just absolutely
Yeah, definitely.
fascinating.
So the anthropic principle is this idea that the universe and the earth look like it was made for people. You take a look at the universe. We talked already about the fine-tuning of the universe and those physical constants. But when you take a look at something like the earth and the solar system that we're in, there are some very specific things to where we are within our solar system. We're in that Goldilocks zone of just close enough to the sun to have liquid water on our planet and not far enough away that it turns to ice. We don't have these wide temperature fluctuations on our planet. Sometimes it feels like, maybe there are wide temperature fluctuations, but not compared to other planets that we see within our solar system. There are, the fact that we have a moon, the moon acts as kind of like a defender for our Earth. Because of the gravitational attraction of the moon and everything, it just kind of sweeps things out of the way that could then threaten life here on Earth, that's kind of nice. Even when you're taking a look at our solar system and where our solar system sits within the galaxy, we're in one of the arms of our galaxy, the Milky Way, right? And if on first glance you take a look at it and you say, oh, there's nothing really special about where we are. There's nothing really special about this place that we have. Because we're kind of off, we're not like in the center of things near the black hole or anything like that. We're kind of like off in one of the arms. But the fact that we're off in one of the arms means that we don't have a whole lot of stars around us, which gives us the opportunity to have greater observations of the universe beyond our galaxy. So it looks like we are positioned in a place where we could observe the universe and we could learn more things about the God that created us. So there are very many things that, on first glance you could see, oh, that's not too special, or that's not anything. The universe, our planet, our solar system, it was created just right for us. Hey.
Hi, Steve.
It's good to see you, Dan.
So my question is from a pure scientific point of view, is the universe considered infinite or finite? And what would be the ramifications of that answer?
Right. So I believe that the universe, according to best scientific understanding, at this point would be finite. But it is expanding. So that's one of the kind of the strange things, is not only is the universe expanding, you have this Big Bang, you would expect that things would expand, but because of gravitational attraction, you would think that things would slow down and maybe eventually go back to, a crunch. And so that was one of the ways that scientists started to, see maybe there's a way for us to get around this idea of the Big Bang, because maybe it's this oscillating universe kind of idea where there's a bang and then a crunch and then a bang and a crunch, that type of idea. But what we've seen through our measurements of things like the redshift is that not only is the universe expanding, but it's accelerating as it's expanding. So the universe is getting bigger and bigger, and it's getting bigger faster. So that doesn't make sense if the only force that was acting on things was the force of gravity. So there's got to be something else that's in the works there that's causing things to expand in an accelerating fashion. So there's the observable universe that we see around us, because if the speed of light is 3 times 10 to the 8th meters per second, then if the universe is 13.8 billion years old, then we can only see things that have, allowed the light to reach us. And so we really can't see anything that's beyond that. It's not something that we can really speak to, if that makes sense.
You got a software update to do later. But my question is with the biologos. Just in watching these videos, you can just sort of just debunk or look, it's like there's so many holes. And then you got to sort of throw it back to where Jesus says, you're either hot or cold, you can't be lukewarm. And bios logos just to me just feels so lukewarm. And how is that accepted? Or even just knowing that, there's the Christians who are like, oh, I totally go with this. But yet, even that, looking at that verse itself, it seems like it's just, I don't want to say this, but I don't want to do that, so I'm going to be in the middle.
I would see that this is one of those things, again, we talked about that quote from the Archbishop towards the beginning of the talk, that, in essentials, we're going to have unity. We need to be hot on those things, right? We need to hold those tightly, the things that are the essentials to our faith. And then there are going to be kind of debatable matters. And I would see that this and how specifically God worked everything out to create the universe and to create life, that there's a difference of opinion on how that all came to be. And so we should have some liberty in that and different viewpoints that we can hold on to. But in all things, we're going to have love for one another. This, for me, is not one of those things that is an essential of the faith. It's something that could be, you could view it one way or another person could view it a different way. And for you, thinking about that picture of the young woman versus the old woman, there are certain things that you look at and those are very convincing to you. Whereas somebody who would hold to that biologos viewpoint, maybe somebody who's a trained geneticist, the person who actually, there was a book that was written back, I think it came out in 2007, called The Language of God, and really kind of espousing this viewpoint. And it was written by the person who was the head of the Human Genome Project. And so because of his understanding of the human genome and that science, he had to find a way for his scientific understanding to match up with his faith. And so those arguments for him are extremely convincing. But I think different people are going to be convinced by different, pieces of evidence.
You talked a little bit about like the fine tuning of our planet and stuff in our universe and our solar system, or in our galaxy. But if a universe as big as ours, people will say, well, then of course somewhere in there you're going to find someone somewhere with the perfect conditions to support life. So are there any, not just like solar system and galaxy specific, but more universal specific fine tunings for life? I know you mentioned like the mass of the electron, and I've read that the mass of the universe in general, but are there other universal fine tunings that are very specifically made for humans?
Right. So all of those physical constants that are baked into the standard model. So the standard model of physics, which helps us to understand the four fundamental forces and how they kind of meld together, that those constants, like the strength of the gravitational force, like the strength of the electromagnetic force, there are, I think, around 18 or so different parameters that go into the standard model, that there's no physical reason, there's no natural reason why they should have a certain value. They're just kind of baked into the cake, and they're just given to us. And all of those conspire together in such a way that it supports life as we know it. And if any one of those were changed by even just the slightest amount, then life would not be possible. So if you're talking about more universal specifics to that anthropic principle. That's what I really point to, is those fundamental constants. Cool.
I feel bad for everybody that left because I think I figured it out. But no, just more on a personal level, you know, your experience in education and in the field that you're working in, and then with your spiritual walk. Do you ever feel conflicted in those things? And are we getting smarter academically? You know, are we, you know, everything that we're discovering, is it just more knowledge, or are we getting, you know, are we getting closer to answers?
Great. So when looking at my own personal experiences, I would tell you, I think it's in Romans where Paul talks about how we shouldn't, you know, we're not ashamed of the gospel, right? And when I first became a Christian, to be honest with you, I was ashamed of the gospel. Because I believed it to be true that Jesus is my Savior. But I didn't know how to reconcile that with everything that was told to me through my education and through my family. So I had a really difficult time in sharing my faith with other people for the longest time, because I felt like I was being duplicitous in my approach towards understanding the world. And so coming to find truths in things like the anthropic principle and the fine-tuning of the universe, and this idea that we live in a world that looks like it's specifically designed to support our kind of life, is extremely freeing for me. And so it's become a really, you know, I love talking about this kind of stuff, because it, many people just are under the assumption that science and faith are completely at odds with each other, and that if you're a person of science and reason, then you're not going to be a person of faith, that you can have no type of spirituality to your life, and vice versa. And that's simply not the case. So in regards to the second part of your question, you know, are we actually getting smarter? You know, we're gaining knowledge, definitely. And, you know, over the course of time, you have some assertions that people make that as we gain more knowledge, we see, okay, actually some of those underlying assumptions, those are false. And so we don't hold to those things anymore. And our understanding of the world, it develops and it changes and it improves. So, you know, here in this world, we're never going to have perfect knowledge. You know, right now we see in part, we hear in part, we know in part. But when Jesus returns, we'll know fully. So we can and should, I think, continue to pursue knowledge and greater understanding, and to be prepared to give an answer for the reason, you know, that for the hope that we have in Jesus. But you know, at the same time, it's also going to be a process of ongoing revelation and learning.
This is more of a spiritual question, but do you think there'll ever be a point in science when there's just so much evidence for God that it just becomes completely unreasonable? You have to be irrational not to believe in God, or do you think that such an end is even possible to reach, or do you think like that's just the condition of humanity and our souls, our spirits there'll always be people that will, regardless of all the evidence for God found in science, that will still reject God?
Yeah, you know, that's a great question. And I think, again, in Romans, Paul talks about how, you know, although God has made himself apparent and visible to us through nature, that we rejected him, and that people, because of their proud hearts, have turned away towards their own wickedness. And so God, being a God of choice, one who does not force himself upon anyone, I think that we'll be able to make better and better arguments for God's existence, and we'll be able to support that through the evidence that we see in the world around us, maybe making appeals towards this type of irreducible complexity, or the information that's contained within our DNA and all of that. At the end of the day, though, I think that there are going to be many people who, just because they've determined in their hearts that there is no God, that they'll reject him. And I saw that in my dad's life for a long, long time. So I'll share this. When I first became a Christian, I was 18 years old, and it was hard for me to tell my dad that I was a Christian. He found out, obviously I'm going to church. He knew that on Sunday mornings. So like, oh, all right, that's fine. He told me, as long as you whatever, he had certain things that he didn't want me to do. And then I started doing them, like giving, and he was like, why are you doing that? Dad, I'm grateful for this God who I see has saved my life. And he's so critical, so hard-hearted. And I would be praying for my dad, 20 years. 20 years I prayed for my dad. Pastor John knows this. We've talked about this before, and how he was so resistant to anything, regarding God or questions of spirituality and Jesus. And then towards the end of his life, my dad is older. He was 56 when I was born. Can you believe that? Man, I'm 45 right now. Having a baby right now, I can't think of that. But, so my dad, when he was in his mid-90s, he started to soften quite a bit more towards this idea of Jesus. And just before he passed, I had the opportunity to speak to him and to share the gospel with him one more time. And, it was a good conversation. And I know that I moved the ball forward a little bit more. But it wasn't that conversation with me. It was my brother Kevin who spoke with my dad just before he passed, and presented the gospel one last time and asked him, do you want to receive Jesus as your Lord, as your Savior? And my dad said yes. So Scripture talks about how, Jesus is gentle, and that a bruised reed he will not break, and a smoldering wood he will not snuff out. But at the same time, he is persistent. And, God's desire is not for any of us to perish, but for all to come to saving knowledge of Jesus and to have everlasting life. So I don't think we should ever give up hope. I do think that people will be proud and arrogant and resist the work of the Holy Spirit. But ultimately, I'm grateful for the Hound of Heaven continuing to pursue my dad, and for that transformation that took place in his life.
That's probably the perfect place to end it. And we'll have round 2 next time with Chet Lewis and Dr. Stephen Ichiriu. That was awesome. Thank you, Stephen, for your generosity. Thanks for your kindness. Thanks for taking extra time. We just love and appreciate you so much. God bless you guys. Thanks for coming tonight. God bless you. Have a great night.